Lee's decision to invade Pennsylvania was intended to disrupt Union offensive plans, alleviating pressure on Richmond, and additionally, it would allow Virginia farmers to tend to their crops without interruption and potentially sway disheartened northern populations towards supporting a political peace settlement. Lee also hoped that the invasion might relieve pressure on Vicksburg in Mississippi. Prior to the invasion of Pennsylvania, the Confederate Army faced significant logistical challenges. Soldiers had been placed on reduced rations, receiving only 18 ounces of flour and 4 ounces of bacon per day, this amounting to just about 1,800 calories. This, modern science tells us, is an insufficient diet, and it led to weight loss amongst the troop. Additionally, the lack of fresh vegetables and fruit in the army resulted in an onset of a scurvy epidemic, prompting regiments to send out foraging parties to scavenge for edible weeds such as sassafras buds, lamb's quarters, and wild onions. The supply issues were primarily due to logistical failures rather than a lack of production. The Confederate government did not pass laws to regulate railroads for military use, nor did they exempt railroad engineers or other maintenance personnel from conscription. So consequently, the remaining men who were left to work on the railroad were not always adequately trained to maintain the industry. Now, the question of when the idea to invade Pennsylvania comes up, and it's difficult to answer this. There's various clues that says that this was something in Lee's mind for a very long time. We know of the Battle of Antietam at Sharpsburg in 1862. However, concrete plan for the invasion of Pennsylvania, the first evidence we have of that is in February of 1863, on the 23rd. Confederate topographical engineer Jedediah Hotchkiss received secret orders from General Jackson to prepare a map of the Valley of Virginia, modern-day Shenandoah Valley, with it extending all the way up to Harrisburg in Pennsylvania, and then show the major topographical features leading out towards Philadelphia. This map was intended to be kept a profound secret and was completed on March 4th. Additionally, by May 19th, General Robert E. Lee had recommended to the Secretary of War, James Seddon, an invasion of the North, believing that it would relieve the pressure on the Confederate forces in Tennessee and Mississippi. In the first week of June, Lee's Confederates set off from the forests of the wilderness, heading north with the objective of invading Pennsylvania. This invasion posed a real threat to northern cities and towns, including Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and even Washington, D.C. itself. Lee's primary objective was the city of Harrisburg. Capturing the capital would not only be a significant coup for Lee, but it would also disrupt bridges, roads, canals. It would disperse military personnel. It would capture major military stores and disrupt telegraph communications between the western states and Washington, D.C. If Lee could cross the Susquehanna River and take Harrisburg, destroying the bridges both above and below the city, then the Army of the Potomac would be forced to construct new ones, giving Confederates time to move more freely through eastern Pennsylvania. And for Lee, ultimate victory lay on the east bank of the Susquehanna River. If you were to look at the progress of the Confederate invasion, you would see that it begins at the very base of the Cumberland Valley. Traveling up modern Route 81, they captured Chambersburg, then moved further north and east to Shippensburg, then capturing Carlisle, and then the detailed report that I'm going to give as part of this video begins with the action around Harrisburg, beginning with the capture of Mechanicsburg. Now, Mechanicsburg was a town of some 2,000 inhabitants, and it was definitely the next target of the rebels after the capture of Carlisle, since it was on the railroad and telegraph line. However, the people of this town showed very little anxiety when they heard that the Confederates were coming. On Friday, a train came out of Bridgeport, the town next to Harrisburg, to evacuate any goods and stores that were still in the warehouses of Mechanicsburg, and on Saturday, rail services were discontinued. The telegraph operator at Mechanicsburg disconnected his instruments and took them with him to Harrisburg. With the cutting of the rail line, with the removal of the telegraph wires, Mechanicsburg was now virtually isolated from the rest of the outside world. Now, the Confederate officer that's going to take the main stage in the area around this is going to be General Jenkins. He and his Confederate brigade approached Mechanicsburg from the west, moving cautiously through the morning mists along Trindle Road. Jenkins was an experienced military officer and was always in fear of an ambush. His previous method for entering enemy towns was to halt his force just outside and send a few scouts into the town. Once the scouts relayed an all-clear signal, he would then lead his force in a charge at a gallop down to the town square. Using this tactic was designed to frighten the civilians into complying with his demands. On this occasion, he halted near Trindle Spring and divided his brigade into two columns. The leading one consisted of the 16th Virginia Cavalry Regiment under Colonel M.J. Ferguson, who was Jenkins' second-in-command. With the 36th Virginia Cavalry Battalion and William L. Jackson's Charlottesville Artillery Battery attached as support. This column Jenkins sent north to the Hugstown Road, and Colonel Ferguson's mission was to proceed to the Carlisle Pike, turn east, and advance to within shooting distance of the Oyster Point Tavern, an area that's going to be referred to as Oyster Point. There he was to await further orders. Now, as Jenkins was standing on the west side of Mechanicsburg, Ferguson marched east on Carlisle Pike just as he was ordered to do. When he came to the Salem Church on a plateau east of Silver Spring Creek, he could see to his front a hill called Sporting Hill, and at the top of this hill was a brigade-sized element of Union soldiers. Colonel Ferguson had Jackson unlimber one of his guns and fire a few rounds at this Union force. Jackson's gunnery skills were very, very poor. His was a newly organized battery that had never really fired cannons outside of artillery drill before. So the shots went wide and never came close to hitting any of the intended targets. However, this didn't matter. The shots served their purpose, and the fresh Union recruits, upon hearing enemy fire, abandoned Sporting Hill and retreated back to Oyster Point. So while all this was going on, General Jenkins was with the other half of his brigade in the west side of Mechanicsburg. The Confederate commander was sitting on his horse at a junction where the Simpsons Ferry Road merged with Trindle Road, and he was staring intently down both roads with his field glasses onto the main street near the town center, where he could see flying from a building what he referred to as the old garrison flag. This is what the rebels dubbed the Stars and Stripes. He was wondering if the town was occupied by federal troops and if it would be defended. So, as a precaution, Jenkins emplaced two guns from the 2nd Maryland Artillery Company under the command of Captain William H. Griffin in the roads so that they had a clear line of fire down either approach. Once the guns were in place, he sent two scouts carrying a white flag on a stick down the road into the middle of town to arrange a parley with whoever was in charge of the town. At the square, the Confederate scouts asked several citizens where the mayor could be found, and following the directions to a house near the far edge of East Main Street, the Burgess, George Hummel, promptly answered their knock. Noticing that the flag had disappeared, the scouts told him to surrender it. It needed to be surrendered to them because it was a symbol of resistance, and unless he wished his town to be shelled by artillery, he should hand the old garrison flag, the Stars and Stripes, the American flag, over to them. Hummel reluctantly produced the flag, which he had hidden. He later wrote that he was chagrined to see how the rebels folded the old banner carelessly and tucked it under their saddles. As the two scouts prepared to ride back to their commander, they ordered Hummel to follow them, and that the commander wanted a word with him. Upon meeting with General Jenkins, Burgess Hummel answered all of his questions, saying that the town was undefended and that it contained no Union troops. Jenkins declared that the citizens who complied with his instructions would suffer no harm, and further, that their property would be respected, with the exception of certain items which would be requisitioned for the use by the Confederate Army. Although he assured the citizens that these items would be paid for. The townspeople were to be informed that in the town square by noon they should deliver 1,500 rations of forage for a like number of horses. As the town people busied gathering the demanded supplies, Jenkins led his column at a walk, silently, except for the clack of horse hooves and the clatter of artillery wheels, down Main Street to a field on the far eastern edge of town. There, the troops dismounted and began to care for their horses, while the officers and sergeants assigned details for picketing, scouts, and foraging duty. Upon securing a bivouac site for his men, Jenkins and his aides rode back into town. He and his officers entered the Ashland House, which was a hotel sitting about a block north of the town square, near the Mechanicsburg Railroad Station. They called upon the proprietors for refreshments and for recent issues of local New York and Philadelphia newspapers. The general understood that by reading these newspapers he could gather better information than sending out any scouts or spies. Harrisburg at this time was full of reporters and editors who had descended upon the city in the expectation of an impending battle. And the New York Herald had even printed an excellent map of the city and its vicinity, including the positions of fortifications and river crossings. This is one feature that undoubtedly interested the Confederates, as well as other editorials commenting on the seeming reluctance of Pennsylvanians to defend their own state. After his rest at Ashland House, General Jenkins and his officers, true to their word, paid for their meals. However, the payment was in the form of Confederate paper money, which was considered useless north of the Mason-Dixon line. When the proprietors objected to this form of payment, Jenkins, mounting his horse, replied that this was all they had. Around this time, Jenkins had been informed of Colonel Ferguson's actions on the road north and rode off in that direction with a 60-man escort. Colonel Ferguson and several other officers were at the spring house near Oarsbridge. Ferguson had emplaced 2 cannons of Jackson's battery in front of the house, in a position that was anchored by the Canandaigua Creek on the left. Jenkins approved of this position, believing that it was strong in the event of an enemy counterattack. He then rode south to the junction of St. John's Church Road and Trindle Road. There he met with Confederate Colonel Cochran near the cemetery of Peace Church. Here Jenkins placed 4 Parrott guns in front of the church, all aiming towards Oyster Point. General Jenkins was standing by the church observing the point through his field glasses. The general thought he saw a line of Union skirmishers along the edge of the trees, and Jenkins decided to fire a cannon at the edge of the woods to see what would be driven out. The first shell caused a Union cavalry patrol to fall back towards the Susquehanna River. However, Union infantry pickets held their line. Jenkins, seeing this activity, thought Union forces were preparing to launch an attack on his position and loudly ordered his men to take cover behind the stone wall that surrounded the cemetery. After a short delay, the Confederate artillery was answered by some Union artillery fire from the Philadelphia Home Guard artillery. However, their fire fell about a mile short of the Confederates. One of their rounds even blew a hole through the Oyster Point Tavern, which was at the center of the Union picket line. The Union battery continued firing on this position until one of the pickets was able to deliver a message to them, giving them the Confederates' actual coordinates. The Confederate gunners of the 2nd Maryland Artillery were veterans, having been in service since 1861, but the Confederates could not see much from Peace Church because of the intervening houses and trees, and were firing blindly into the scene. The exchange of cannon fire was plainly heard from Harrisburg, and many citizens climbed to the top of their roofs or flocked to the Susquehanna River banks for a better view of the big battle that they thought was in the making. But honestly, this action could scarcely qualify as a battle. Most of the rebels, and the Union soldiers for that matter, were well behind the fields of fire and were not in immediate danger. The afternoon artillery duel continued until dusk, when Jenkins withdrew his line. Jenkins and his staff officers occupied the Rupp House, which is a stone building on Trindle Road. The night of the 28th passed quietly, except for, towards morning, a Confederate patrol was fired upon when they attempted to penetrate the picket line near Oyster Point. Private John Manley of Company G, 71st New York, was wounded in the thigh. He was given treatment at the Harrisburg Hospital and then sent home to New York by rail. He was the only casualty of this day. The rebel artillery, back at Peace Church just as they had the preceding day, resumed firing sometime that morning. The artillery fire on Monday was mostly from Jackson's 2 guns. Though they were less experienced, they did have a better view of the Union line at Oyster Point than the cannons at Peace Church. Still, no great amount of damage was done. though several buildings in the area had holes in their walls and roofs after the firing had ceased. This really concludes the major action of the Confederates in their advance towards Harrisburg. So the question is, if the objective was Harrisburg and the territory beyond to disrupt Union lines of communication and Union supply, what changed? Why did the Confederates fall back from Harrisburg? Because clearly it was not the vigorous defense of the city. Jenkins only had 1,600 men with him, and the Union forces clearly were not able to drive him off. So the question is, what changed? Well, on the evening of June 28th, General Robert E. Lee was at his headquarters near Chambersburg. He had just sent out the orders of operations for the three corps for the next day, the 29th. General Ewell was to spearhead an attack and take the city of Harrisburg. General Longstreet was to march up from Chambersburg in support of General Ewell's main attack. And A.P. Hill was to move his forces west to York and then to Whitesville. From there, he would cross the Susquehanna downstream from Harrisburg, seizing the railroads and telegraph lines between Harrisburg and Philadelphia, effectively isolating the city. Lee was extremely confident that this plan was very much doable, though he was still a little uneasy because he had not heard from Stuart since the 25th and had no idea what was going on with the Federal Army. At 10 p.m. that evening, an officer came in from General Longstreet saying that a scout by the name of Harrison had just come in with news of General Hooker and the Union Army. He said that General Hooker had been relieved by General George Meade, and Harrison had learned that the Army of the Potomac had finally crossed into Maryland and was intent on finding and fighting Lee's army. He decided at once that what counteraction he needed to take. Lee considered it of the greatest importance to keep open his lines of communication and supply. For although he could easily secure food and fodder from the Pennsylvania countryside, he could not easily obtain a resupply of ammunition, and he needed it delivered from friendly depots in the South. Furthermore, he required uninterrupted channel of evacuation for captured soldiers and the wounded. The best way for him to prevent this was to divert Meade's attention away from any plan to cut off his connection with Virginia. To do this, Lee would move his own army to threaten Washington and Baltimore, and thus detain Meade on the east side of the Blue Ridge Mountains. He immediately countermanded all previous orders, telling all forces to drive towards Gettysburg. Ewell, who had been occupying the town of Carlisle, started his march before daylight on the morning of June 30th. His column would move down the York Pike toward Heidlersburg and then towards Gettysburg. Yet for some unknown reason, Ewell did not recall General Jenkins' brigade from his position in Mechanicsburg. This was strange, since now Ewell knew he was marching towards the direction of the enemy and would need Jenkins' cavalry to act as a scouting force and a screen against any federal forces. Jedediah Hotchkiss, the same map maker who earlier presented the map of the Cumberland Valley to General Jackson, offers an explanation in his diary dated the night of the 29th. He says that General Ewell was quite testy and hard to please. Apparently, Ewell had been looking forward to leading the attack on Harrisburg and was extremely disappointed that he would no longer have that chance. Hotchkiss surmised that because of this disappointment and everyone flying around, that in the bustle of the mental stress, Ewell simply forgot about General Jenkins and his brigade. General Jenkins, from his part, was still expecting there to be an attack on Harrisburg. He had withdrawn his brigade back to Silver Spring Creek, where there was good grazing ground for his horses, fresh water, and plenty of cover. He was stationed in this position, waiting on the arrival of General Ewell's column. There is no evidence that prior to 2 p.m. on June 30th, Jenkins had received any word from Ewell's corps that they had evacuated Carlisle in a move towards Gettysburg. While Jenkins' brigade was at Silver Spring, he sent Company C of the 14th Virginia Cavalry with one cannon from Jackson's battery to hold Sporting Hill. While on this hill, they were to observe any potential Union movement. At approximately 3 p.m., a large force of Union soldiers was seen approaching Sporting Hill. The Confederate cavalry took shelter in a stone barn and prepared to defend their position. When the Federal forces were about 400 yards away to their front, the Confederates in the barn opened fire. None of the Federals were hit by the fire, but their return fire was also ineffective, since it could not penetrate the stone masonry of the barn. After about 5 minutes, Confederate forces emerged from the woods, attempting to outflank the Union force. They were trying to seize a covered position from which to advance against the Federal left flank. However, this force of Federals countered it by sending 2 companies of their own infantry to occupy this intended position, forcing the Confederates to withdraw back to the cover of the trees. The stalemate at the barn continued. Union shots could not penetrate the barn, and the Confederates could not hit the Federal soldiers hiding in the fields. But they continued this back and forth until about 5 p.m. At that time, a Union artillery battery arrived on the site. The eager Federal cannoneers unloaded their ammunition and prepared to fire. A Union officer, seeing their efforts, shouted at them that they should mark the barn as their primary target. Getting ready to fire the first round, the nervous and inexperienced Union artillerymen were inserting the bore backwards. Shouting, a Federal officer ran over to the crew and ordered them to stop. The officer then delivered an impromptu lesson on how to properly load and fire a cannon before allowing one of the cannoneers to pull the lanyard. Amazingly, this first shot was a direct hit on the barn. Instantly, the large barn door swung open, and a swarm of rebels poured out and scurried over themselves through the fields back to their main position behind the tree line. The Federal soldiers, for their part, got up and cheered loudly at this stroke of good fortune, but were quickly hushed by their officers, who cursed them for giving away their own positions. Though a brief artillery duel took place with the Confederate gun, covering the cavalry's retreat, the inexperienced Union gunners, despite their first lucky shot, were still pretty ineffectual. A correspondent from the New York Times, who was with the Union troops, stated that the Confederates, upon withdrawal, left 16 dead men at their former position. The Union officers in their report claimed that between 20 and 30 more Confederates were carried away by their comrades in the retreat. What is clear is that about this time, General Jenkins had realized that he was alone and unsupported, as Ewell's corps were nearly a full day's march south towards Gettysburg. At this point, taking his brigade along with wagons of provisions that he had received from the people of Mechanicsburg, Jenkins disengaged and traveled west along the Carlisle Pike and then south towards Gettysburg.